Thomas Jefferson, the visionary who shaped the United States. Part 1. Colonial America before Thomas Jefferson. In the early 18th century, 13 British colonies stretched along the Atlantic coast of North America, each with its own character and economy. Virginia stood as the oldest and most populous of these colonies, established at Jamestown in 1607. By the time of Thomas Jefferson's birth, Virginia had grown into a prosperous agricultural society, its economy built upon tobacco cultivation and the forced labor of enslaved Africans. The colony's wealthy planter class dominated its political and social life, forming an aristocracy that prided itself on English tradition while simultaneously developing a distinctly American identity. The intellectual currents of the European Enlightenment had begun to flow across the Atlantic by the mid-1700s. Colonial gentlemen read the works of John Locke, who argued that governments derived their authority from the consent of the governed. They studied Montesquieu's theories of separated powers and absorbed the rationalist philosophy that emphasized human reason over inherited authority. These ideas found fertile ground in colonial America, where distance from London had already fostered a tradition of self-governance. The political structure of the colonies reflected this tension between British authority and American autonomy. Each colony had a governor appointed by the Crown or by proprietors, but also elected assemblies that controlled taxation and local affairs. Virginians had established their House of Burgesses in 1619, making it the oldest representative assembly in the colonies. This system of dual authority worked reasonably well until the conclusion of the French and Indian War in 1763. The war had been enormously expensive for Britain, and Parliament decided that the American colonies should help pay for their own defense. The Sugar Act of 1764, the Stamp Act of 1765, and subsequent taxation measures sparked colonial resistance. The colonists argued that Parliament had no right to tax them without their representation in that body. This constitutional dispute would escalate throughout the 1760s and early 1770s, setting the stage for revolution. Into this world of political ferment and philosophical questioning, Thomas Jefferson would emerge as one of the most articulate voices for American independence. Sources used. Empire of Liberty. A History of the Early Republic by Gordon S. Wood. Pages 328. The Oxford History of the United States. The Glorious Cause by Robert Middlecoff. Pages 48-73. Thomas Jefferson and the New Nation. A Biography by Merrill D. Peterson. Pages 319. Part 2. Childhood, Education, and Early Political Career. Thomas Jefferson was born on April 13, 1743, at Shadwell Plantation in Albemarle County, Virginia. His father, Peter Jefferson, was a successful planter and surveyor who had acquired substantial landholdings on Virginia's western frontier. His mother, Jane Randolph, came from one of Virginia's most distinguished families. This combination of frontier enterprise and established aristocracy would shape Jefferson's character throughout his life. When Peter Jefferson died in 1757, 14-year-old Thomas inherited approximately 5,000 acres of land and dozens of enslaved people, making him a man of considerable property while still a boy. Jefferson's education reflected the ambitions of Virginia's planter elite. He studied classical languages, mathematics, and philosophy with private tutors before enrolling at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg in 1760. There he encountered Dr. William Small, a Scottish professor who introduced him to the latest scientific and philosophical thinking from Europe. Small brought Jefferson into the intellectual circle of Governor Francis Fauquier and the prominent lawyer George Wythe. These men discussed Enlightenment philosophy, natural science, and political theory at dinners that Jefferson later called his education in practical politics and refined culture. After completing his formal education, Jefferson read law under George Wythe's direction. He was admitted to the Virginia bar in 1767 and practiced law successfully for several years, handling cases involving land claims, inheritance, and commercial disputes. His legal training reinforced his analytical approach to political questions and gave him practical experience in the application of English common law to American circumstances. On January 1, 1772, Jefferson married Martha Wales Skelton, a wealthy widow. The marriage brought Jefferson additional property, including more enslaved people, though it also brought substantial debts from his father-in-law's estate. The couple settled at Monticello, the mountaintop home Jefferson had begun building on land he inherited from his father. Monticello would become Jefferson's lifelong architectural and agricultural project, reflecting his interests in classical design, innovation, and the Enlightenment ideal of the cultivated gentleman farmer. Jefferson entered the Virginia House of Burgesses in 1769, representing Albemarle County. His early legislative career coincided with escalating tensions between the colonies and Britain. He aligned himself with the more radical members of the House who opposed British taxation policies and restrictions on colonial self-governance. In 1774, Jefferson wrote A Summary View of the Rights of British America, a bold pamphlet arguing that the American colonies were connected to Britain only through their loyalty to the king, not through any authority of Parliament. The pamphlet established Jefferson's reputation as an eloquent advocate for colonial rights and demonstrated his ability to articulate complex constitutional arguments in clear, compelling prose. Sources used. Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power by John Meacham, pages 1554. American Sphinx, The Character of Thomas Jefferson by Joseph J. Ellis, pages 19-47. Jefferson and His Time. Jefferson the Virginian by Dumas Malone, pages 37-158. Part 3. The American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence. When the First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in September 1774, Jefferson did not attend, prevented by illness. However, his summary view had circulated among the delegates and influenced their deliberations. By the time the Second Continental Congress assembled in May 1775, following the battles at Lexington and Concord, Jefferson took his seat as one of Virginia's representatives. Though not yet 33 years old, he had earned respect for his writing ability and his clear thinking on constitutional questions. In June 1776, the Virginia Convention instructed its delegates in Philadelphia to propose independence. Richard Henry Lee introduced the resolution on June 7, declaring that the colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. Congress appointed a committee of 5 to draft a formal declaration. John Adams of Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, Robert Livingston of New York, and Thomas Jefferson of Virginia. The committee selected Jefferson to write the first draft, recognizing his reputation as a skilled writer and his ability to express complex ideas with clarity and force. Jefferson worked on the Declaration in his rented rooms on Market Street, drawing on ideas he had developed in previous writings and on concepts widely discussed among advocates of colonial rights. His draft drew heavily on Enlightenment political philosophy, particularly John Locke's theories of natural rights and the social contract. The Declaration's preamble asserted that all men are created equal and possess unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It argued that governments exist to secure these rights and derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. When a government becomes destructive of these ends, the people have the right to alter or abolish it. The Declaration's longest section enumerated specific grievances against King George III, demonstrating that the king had repeatedly violated the colonists' rights and had become a tyrant unworthy of their allegiance. This litany of complaints served both to justify the revolution to American audiences and to explain the American cause to potential foreign allies. Jefferson's original draft included a passionate condemnation of the slave trade, blaming the king for perpetuating this evil institution. Congress deleted this section, recognizing the hypocrisy of condemning slavery while many delegates, including Jefferson himself, owned enslaved people. Congress debated Jefferson's draft for 3 days, making numerous edits that Jefferson found painful. They removed approximately 1/4 of his text, streamlining the prose and eliminating passages they considered too inflammatory or philosophically excessive. The final version retained Jefferson's essential argument and most of his memorable phrases. On July 4, 1776, Congress approved the Declaration of Independence, and copies were dispatched throughout the colonies. The Declaration became far more than a diplomatic statement of separation from Britain. Its assertion that all men are created equal and possess natural rights became a powerful philosophical foundation for democratic government. Jefferson had synthesized existing political theory into language of extraordinary clarity and emotional power. The Declaration's principles would inspire revolutionary movements worldwide and would be invoked by Americans seeking to expand rights and equality long after Jefferson's death. Jefferson left Congress in September 1776 to return to Virginia, where he believed the real work of revolution was taking place. He served in the Virginia House of Delegates, where he proposed sweeping legal reforms designed to eliminate feudal remnants from Virginia law and establish religious freedom. His bill for establishing religious freedom, drafted in 1777 but not passed until 1786, became one of his proudest achievements. It prohibited government interference in religious belief and ended state support for any church, establishing a principle of separation between church and state that would later be incorporated into the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Jefferson served as governor of Virginia from 1779 to 1781, during some of the most difficult years of the Revolutionary War. British forces invaded Virginia in 1780 and 1781, and Jefferson faced severe criticism for the state's inadequate military preparations. He barely escaped capture when British cavalry raided Charlottesville in June 1781. Though the Virginia Assembly cleared him of any wrongdoing, the experience left Jefferson wounded and defensive about his performance during the crisis. In 1784, Congress appointed him to join John Adams and Benjamin Franklin in negotiating commercial treaties in Europe, and Jefferson sailed for France, where he would serve as American minister for the next 5 years. *** Sources used. *** American Scripture. Making the Declaration of Independence by Pauline Maier, pages 97–153. Thomas Jefferson and the New Nation. A biography by Merrill D. Peterson, pages 84–137. Founding Brothers. The Revolutionary Generation by Joseph J. Ellis, pages 81–119. Jefferson and His Time. Jefferson the Virginian by Dumas Malone, pages 214–89. Part 4. Secretary of State, Vice President and President. When Jefferson returned from France in 1789, President George Washington asked him to serve as the first Secretary of State. Jefferson accepted, though he soon found himself in fundamental disagreement with Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton over the direction of the new nation. Hamilton envisioned a strong federal government that would promote manufacturing and commerce, create a national bank, assume state debts from the Revolutionary War, and maintain close ties with Britain. Jefferson believed these policies would concentrate too much power in the federal government and create a financial aristocracy that would undermine Republican values. He favored an agricultural economy, strict interpretation of the Constitution, strong state governments, and closer relations with France. This disagreement extended beyond policy to competing visions of what America should become. Hamilton saw a commercial, industrial nation with a powerful central government modeled on British institutions. Jefferson imagined a decentralized agrarian republic of independent farmers, each with enough land to guarantee his freedom from economic dependence. These conflicting philosophies led to the formation of America's first political parties. Hamilton's supporters became known as Federalists, while Jefferson's allies formed the Democratic-Republican Party, though they called themselves simply Republicans. The rivalry between Jefferson and Hamilton grew increasingly bitter. Jefferson became convinced that Hamilton and the Federalists wanted to establish monarchy in America and undo the Revolution's achievements. Hamilton believed Jefferson was a dangerous radical whose admiration for France would lead America into chaos. Both men appealed to Washington, who struggled to maintain harmony in his cabinet. Jefferson resigned as Secretary of State at the end of 1793, exhausted by political conflict and eager to return to Monticello. Jefferson's retirement proved temporary. In the presidential election of 1796, under the Constitution's original provisions, he finished second to John Adams and became vice president. The system of having the runner-up serve as vice president created an awkward situation, as Adams was a Federalist and Jefferson led the opposition party. Jefferson had little influence in the Adams administration and spent most of his time presiding over the Senate. The election of 1800 became one of the most contentious in American history. Jefferson faced Adams in a bitter campaign characterized by personal attacks and apocalyptic rhetoric. Federalists warned that Jefferson was an atheist who would destroy religion and bring French revolutionary violence to America. Republicans countered that Adams wanted to establish monarchy and was mentally unbalanced. When electoral votes were counted, Jefferson and his running mate Aaron Burr each received 73 votes, creating a tie that threw the election to the House of Representatives. After 36 ballots and intense political maneuvering, Hamilton persuaded enough Federalists to abstain, allowing Jefferson to win the presidency. Jefferson called his election the Revolution of 1800, believing it had saved the Republic from Federalist tyranny. In his inaugural address, he sought to calm partisan tensions with his famous declaration that "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists." He promised to respect minority rights, maintain freedom of speech and religion, and pursue peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. Jefferson's presidency demonstrated both the possibilities and contradictions of his political philosophy. His greatest achievement came early, with the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. When France offered to sell the entire Louisiana territory for $15 million, Jefferson recognized the extraordinary opportunity despite constitutional doubts about federal authority to acquire new territory. The purchase doubled the nation's size and removed the threat of French presence on America's western border. He then commissioned the Lewis and Clark expedition to explore the new territory and find a route to the Pacific Ocean, combining scientific inquiry with strategic reconnaissance. Jefferson also confronted the Barbary pirates who were seizing American merchant ships and demanding tribute. Though he had long advocated minimal military spending, he sent naval forces to the Mediterranean to protect American commerce, establishing the precedent that the United States would defend its interests abroad. However, his handling of European conflicts proved less successful. Seeking to protect American neutrality during the Napoleonic Wars without military engagement, Jefferson persuaded Congress to pass the Embargo Act of 1807, which prohibited American ships from sailing to foreign ports. He believed economic pressure would force Britain and France to respect American neutrality. Instead, the embargo devastated American commerce, provoked widespread resistance, particularly in Federalist New England, and proved impossible to enforce. Jefferson signed the embargo's repeal just before leaving office, acknowledging one of his presidency's most significant failures. Historians disagree about Jefferson's overall effectiveness as president. Some emphasize his success in expanding the nation's territory, reducing the national debt, and maintaining Republican simplicity in government. Others point to the embargo's failure, his inconsistent constitutional principles, and his inability to address the growing sectional divisions over slavery. Most scholars agree that Jefferson struggled to reconcile his theoretical principles with the practical demands of governing, often adopting policies that contradicted his stated beliefs about limited federal power. Sources used. Thomas Jefferson. The Art of Power by John Meacham. Pages 188–356. Empire of Liberty. A History of the Early Republic by Gordon S. Wood. Pages 355–407. Thomas Jefferson and the New Nation. A Biography by Merrill D. Peterson. Pages 653–891. The Oxford History of the United States. Empire of Liberty by Gordon S. Wood. Pages 63–137. Part 5. Personal Life, Slavery, and Major Controversies. Jefferson's personal life was marked by both deep affection and profound tragedy. His marriage to Martha Wales Skelton produced 6 children, though only 2 daughters survived to adulthood. Martha died in 1782, shortly after the birth of their last child. According to family accounts, Jefferson was devastated by her death and promised her he would never remarry, a promise he kept. His daughter Martha, known as Patsy, became his closest companion and lived near Monticello throughout her life. Monticello itself reveals much about Jefferson's character and contradictions. He spent decades designing and redesigning his home, incorporating classical architectural elements and innovative features including a revolving bookstand, dumbwaiters, and a clock that displayed the day of the week. The house demonstrated Jefferson's commitment to Enlightenment ideals of reason and progress. Yet Monticello's beauty and Jefferson's lifestyle depended entirely on enslaved labor. At the time of his death, Jefferson owned more than 600 people throughout his life, with approximately 200 enslaved at Monticello at any given time. The contradiction between Jefferson's eloquent advocacy for human liberty and his ownership of enslaved people represents the most troubling aspect of his legacy. In his Notes on the State of Virginia, published in 1785, Jefferson condemned slavery as morally wrong and predicted it would eventually destroy the nation. He wrote that he trembled for his country when he reflected that God is just and that divine justice cannot sleep forever. Yet he continued to hold people in bondage, profiting from their labor and never developing a practical plan for emancipation that he was willing to implement. Jefferson's writings on race reveal the deep prejudices common among white Americans of his era. In Notes on the State of Virginia, he speculated that black people were inherently inferior to whites in both intelligence and beauty, though he acknowledged that scientific evidence for such claims remained inconclusive. Modern scholars universally reject Jefferson's racial theories as products of the racist ideology that justified slavery. Some historians argue that Jefferson's scientific racism was particularly harmful because his reputation gave these ideas influential support. The most controversial aspect of Jefferson's personal life involves Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman at Monticello. Hemings was the half-sister of Jefferson's deceased wife Martha, both being daughters of John Wales, though by different mothers. In 1802, journalist James Callender published allegations that Jefferson had fathered children with Hemings. Jefferson never publicly responded to these charges, and his white descendants denied them for 2 centuries. In 1998, DNA testing compared Y chromosome markers from descendants of Sally Hemings' youngest son, Eston, with those of Jefferson's male relatives. The results indicated that a Jefferson male had fathered Eston Hemings. Combined with historical evidence showing that Thomas Jefferson was present at Monticello 9 months before the birth of each of Hemings' 6 children, and absent when conception would have occurred for other children born to enslaved women there, most historians concluded that Thomas Jefferson fathered all of Sally Hemings' children. The Thomas Jefferson Foundation, which operates Monticello, officially accepted this conclusion in 2000 after extensive research. A small number of historians continue to argue for alternative theories, but the overwhelming consensus supports Jefferson's paternity. The relationship between Jefferson and Hemings began when she was approximately 14 years old and accompanied Jefferson's daughter to Paris in 1787. Under French law, Hemings was free and could have remained in France, but she returned to Virginia with Jefferson in 1789. According to the memoir of her son Madison Hemings, Sally agreed to return only after Jefferson promised to free their children when they reached adulthood. Jefferson did free all 4 of Sally Hemings's surviving children, the only enslaved family group he freed. Sally Hemings herself was never formally freed, but was allowed to leave Monticello after Jefferson's death and lived with her freed sons until her death in 1835. Modern understanding of this relationship must acknowledge that it existed within the brutal power structure of slavery. An enslaved woman could not give meaningful consent to her enslaver. Whatever Jefferson's private feelings might have been, the relationship was fundamentally shaped by the fact that he owned Sally Hemings and held absolute power over her life. This reality makes romantic characterizations of their relationship inappropriate and historically inaccurate. Jefferson's financial difficulties also complicate his legacy. Despite his wealth in land and enslaved people, he lived beyond his means throughout his life, accumulating substantial debts. His expensive tastes, including fine wine, books, and architectural projects, combined with agricultural losses and economic downturns, left him deeply in debt. At his death, his estate was insolvent, forcing the sale of Monticello and most of the enslaved people who lived there, separating families and sending people who had lived at the plantation for generations to new owners. Sources used. American Sphinx. The Character of Thomas Jefferson by Joseph J. Ellis, pages 228-304. Master of the Mountain. Thomas Jefferson and His Slaves by Henry Wiensek, pages 136, 127-68. The Hemingses of Monticello. An American Family by Annette Gordon Reed, pages 305-658. Thomas Jefferson and the New Nation. A Biography by Merrill D. Peterson, pages 707-739. Part 6. Final Years and Intellectual Legacy. Jefferson left the presidency in March 1809 and returned to Monticello, relieved to escape what he called the splendid misery of public life. He never again left Virginia, spending his final 17 years in retirement at his mountaintop home. Yet his mind remained active, and he continued to influence American intellectual and political life through extensive correspondence and one final great achievement. Jefferson devoted much of his retirement to establishing the University of Virginia. He conceived of the university as an institution devoted to the advancement of knowledge and the cultivation of informed citizens capable of self-government. Working with nothing to build upon, Jefferson designed the buildings, selected the faculty, designed the curriculum, and supervised every detail of the university's creation. He based the architectural plan on classical models, creating an academical village centered on a rotunda modeled after the Roman Pantheon. The university opened in 1825, and Jefferson considered it one of his 3 most important accomplishments, along with authoring the Declaration of Independence and the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. Jefferson's retirement years also saw a remarkable renewal of his friendship with John Adams. The 2 founders had been close allies during the Revolution, but became bitter political enemies in the 1790s and did not communicate for more than a decade. In 1812, mutual friends encouraged them to reconcile, and Adams wrote to Jefferson, initiating a correspondence that continued for the rest of their lives. Their letters, numbering more than 150, discussed philosophy, politics, history, and the meaning of the American Revolution. They debated aristocracy and democracy, reflected on their careers, and examined questions of religion and mortality. This correspondence represents one of the great intellectual dialogues in American history and revealed both men's capacity for forgiveness and their shared commitment to ideas over personal animosity. Jefferson's health declined gradually during his final years. He suffered from rheumatism, digestive problems, and difficulty urinating. He remained mentally sharp, reading constantly and maintaining his daily routines, but his physical condition deteriorated. By June 1826, as the nation prepared to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson was clearly dying. He asked his doctor on July 3rd if he would survive until the 4th. When assured he might, Jefferson seemed determined to do so. Thomas Jefferson died at Monticello on July 4, 1826, exactly 50 years after Congress approved the Declaration of Independence. Remarkably, John Adams died the same day at his home in Massachusetts. Adams's last words were reported to be, "Thomas Jefferson survives," not knowing his friend had died a few hours earlier. The coincidence of the two founding figures dying on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration struck Americans as almost providential, suggesting that history itself had honored their contributions. News of Jefferson's death spread across the nation through newspapers and public announcements. Communities held memorial services, and speakers eulogized Jefferson as the author of American liberty and the voice of Republican principles. The University of Virginia held a funeral ceremony attended by thousands. Jefferson was buried at Monticello in a simple grave, as he had requested. He had written his own epitaph, listing 3 achievements he wished to be remembered for: author of the Declaration of Independence, author of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. Notably absent were any references to his governorship of Virginia, his diplomatic service, or his presidency, suggesting that Jefferson valued his intellectual and educational contributions above his political offices. Sources used. Thomas Jefferson. The Art of Power by John Meacham, pages 457–502. Twilight at Monticello. The Final Years of Thomas Jefferson by Allen Pell Crawford, pages 147–54. The Adams-Jefferson Letters edited by Lester J. Cappan, pages 274–614. Jefferson and His Time. The Sage of Monticello by Dumas Malone, pages 471–8. Part 7. Legacy and Historical Importance. Thomas Jefferson's influence on American democracy and global political thought extends far beyond his lifetime. The principles articulated in the Declaration of Independence became foundational to American identity and inspired democratic movements worldwide. The Declaration's assertion that all men are created equal and possess unalienable rights has been invoked by successive generations of Americans seeking to expand liberty and equality. Abolitionists cited Jefferson's words against slavery, women's suffrage advocates used them to argue for voting rights, and civil rights leaders built upon the Declaration's promise of equality. Martin Luther King Jr. famously described the Declaration of Independence as a promissory note that America had failed to honor for black citizens, demonstrating how Jefferson's words continued to shape American political discourse nearly 2 centuries after they were written. Jefferson's contributions to religious freedom had similarly lasting impact. His Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom established the principle that government should not interfere in matters of conscience or faith. This concept influenced the First Amendment to the Constitution, which prohibited Congress from establishing religion or interfering with its free exercise. Jefferson's famous phrase describing a wall of separation between church and state, written in an 1802 letter to the Danbury Baptist Association, became a guiding principle in American constitutional interpretation, though debates continue about exactly where that wall should stand. Jefferson's political philosophy shaped American constitutional thought in both productive and problematic ways. His advocacy for limited federal government, strict construction of the Constitution, and protection of individual rights influenced generations of American politicians. The Democratic Party claims Jefferson as a founder, pointing to his support for agrarian interests and suspicion of concentrated power. Yet Jefferson's own presidency demonstrated the difficulty of maintaining ideological purity when governing, as his purchase of Louisiana and his embargo policies both contradicted his stated principles of limited federal power. Jefferson's role in founding the University of Virginia demonstrated his lifelong commitment to education as essential to democratic government. He believed that only an educated citizenry could sustain self-government and resist tyranny. The university he created became a model for American public higher education, emphasizing broad liberal arts education, academic freedom, and the advancement of knowledge through research. His conviction that democracy required educated citizens continues to influence American educational philosophy. Internationally, the Declaration of Independence became one of history's most influential political documents. Revolutionaries in France, Latin America, and Asia invoked Jefferson's principles when challenging monarchical and colonial governments. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948, echoes the Declaration of Independence in asserting universal human dignity and equality. Jefferson's articulation of natural rights and popular sovereignty provided a philosophical foundation for democratic movements globally. Yet Jefferson's legacy is profoundly complicated by the contradiction between his eloquent advocacy for liberty and his ownership of enslaved people. This tension has led historians to reassess Jefferson's place in American history. Some scholars emphasize that Jefferson was a man of his time, sharing the prejudices common to white Virginians of the 18th century, and that his intellectual contributions should be evaluated separately from his personal failings. Others argue that Jefferson's continuation of slavery, while understanding its evil, makes him particularly culpable, and that his failure to act on his stated principles reveals a fundamental moral failure that taints his entire legacy. The historical consensus has shifted substantially over time. For much of the 19th and 20th centuries, historians portrayed Jefferson as an idealistic philosopher-statesman, minimizing or excusing his slaveholding. The civil rights movement prompted historians to examine more critically the gap between American ideals and American reality, with Jefferson embodying that contradiction. The confirmation of Jefferson's relationship with Sally Hemings further complicated his image, replacing the marble monument with a more complex and troubling human figure. Contemporary historians generally present Jefferson as a man of extraordinary intellectual gifts and profound contradictions. Joseph Ellis describes him as the American Sphinx, brilliant yet enigmatic, capable of holding contradictory ideas without apparent discomfort. John Meacham emphasizes Jefferson's pragmatic use of power despite his theoretical opposition to centralized authority. Annette Gordon Reed has illuminated the world of enslaved people at Monticello, particularly the Hemings family, giving voice to people Jefferson claimed to own and revealing the human cost of his lifestyle. Henry Wiensek has argued that Jefferson became more committed to slavery over time as he recognized its profitability, challenging earlier interpretations that Jefferson was consistently troubled by the institution. Jefferson memorials and public memory reflect these evolving interpretations. The Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C., dedicated in 1943, presents Jefferson as a symbol of American ideals, with his words about equality and freedom inscribed on its walls. Yet visitors increasingly wrestle with the contradiction between these ideals and Jefferson's enslaving of hundreds of people. At Monticello, interpretation has evolved to include extensive discussion of slavery and the enslaved community, with tour focusing on enslaved workers and their contributions alongside Jefferson's architectural achievements. In 2018, Monticello opened an exhibition about Sally Hemings, acknowledging her relationship with Jefferson and the 6 children they had together. Debates about Jefferson's legacy continue in contemporary America. Some argue for removing his memorials or renaming institutions that honor him, viewing his slaveholding as disqualifying. Others contend that Jefferson's intellectual contributions to American democracy remain valuable despite his moral failures, and that understanding the contradictions in his life helps illuminate the complexity of American history. Most historians avoid simple judgments, instead presenting Jefferson as a figure who must be understood in all his complexity. What remains undeniable is Jefferson's enduring influence on American political thought and global democracy. The principles he articulated in the Declaration of Independence continue to inspire people seeking freedom and equality. His insistence that governments derive their authority from the consent of the governed remains foundational to democratic theory. His advocacy for religious freedom, public education, and intellectual inquiry shaped American institutions. At the same time, his failure to reconcile his ideals with his actions, particularly regarding slavery, serves as a reminder that professing noble principles does not absolve one from moral responsibility to act upon them. Thomas Jefferson thus remains one of American history's most influential and most debated figures, his legacy encompassing both the highest aspirations of the American experiment and its most troubling contradictions. *** Sources used. *** American Sphinx. The Character of Thomas Jefferson by Joseph J. Ellis. Pages 318, 363-377 Founding Brothers. The Revolutionary Generation by Joseph J. Ellis. Pages 206-248 Master of the Mountain. Thomas Jefferson and His Slaves by Henry Wiensek. Pages 269-276 Thomas Jefferson, Author of America by Christopher Hitchens. Pages 137, 187-198 The Hemingses of Monticello. An American Family by Annette Gordon Reed. Pages 659-669.